Unit 4, Project Planning, Scheduling and Monitoring. See here, what happens to here, project planning, then scheduling and monitoring. There are three kinds of things is there. These three kinds of things, uh, project planning, scheduling and monitoring. See, nature of project planning. What is meaning by nature of project planning? Defining the project objectives, scope, scope definitions, work breakdown structure (WBS), sequencing and dependence, estimating resource and duration, scheduling, risk identification and mitigation, resource allocation, budgeting and cost estimation, communication and stakeholder engagement, documentation. See, defining the project objectives to identify the project, and make the objectives. You make the five objectives or three objectives and eight objectives depending upon the projects. Next, whatever current, there are three: past, future and present. The project have scope from the future days. Whatever present technology is there and future technology is there, that future technology always you have do the work breakdown structure. What is calling about WBS? See here, the project planning process typically work breakdown structure, sequencing and dependence. See, project planning involves determining the sequence of activities and identifying the dependencies among them. This includes identifying tasks that must be completed in a specific order, tasks that can be conducted in parallel or concurrently. That is calling about uh, estimating the resource and durations. See, scheduling. What is calling about the scheduling? Project planning includes developing a project schedule, which involves assigning the start and end date activities based on their estimated duration and project timeline. That is calling about scheduling. Next, risk identification and mitigation. What is calling about the, you want to find out the risk and then will be mitigation. That is calling about risk identification and mitigation. Resource allocations. Next, I am talking about resource allocations. Project planning includes allocating the resource to different project activities based on their requirement, availability, project priorities. This involves again assigning the personnel, equipment, and material to specific tasks, ensuring their availability when needed. That is calling about resource allocations, budgeting and cost estimation. What is calling about budgeting and cost estimation? Project planning involves developing a budget by estimating the cost associated with each activity, including the resource, materials, overhead, and contingents. This is calling about budgeting and cost estimation, communication and stakeholder engagement. What is calling about communication stakeholder engagement? Project planning includes identifying the project stakeholder, developing a communication plan to ensure effective and time communication with all relative parties. This is calling. communication and stakeholder engagement. Documentation. Project planning involves documenting the project plan, which includes all the planning activities, decisions, assumptions, and constraints. This is calling about documentation. Need for the project planning. What are the need is there in the project planning? Clarity of objectives. The first one is clarity of objectives, scope definition, resource definition. Third one is resource definition and resource allocation. Fourth one is time management. Fifth one is risk management. Sixth one is stakeholder engagement. Seventh one is budgeting and cost control. Eighth one, communication and coordination. Ninth one, decision making. Tenth one, monitoring and control. See, total you have 10 points is there. A need for project planning, clarity of objectives, scope definition. See, what is there in the first point? A clarity of objectives, scope definition, resource definition, time management, risk management, stakeholder engagement, budgeting and cost control, communication and coordination, decision making, monitoring and control. Clarity of objectives, scope definition, resource definition, time management, risk manage. See, need for project planning. What are the need is there in the project? Clarity of objective. You want to make the good clarity in the project. That is clarity of objective. Scope. You have a good scope is there in the future in that particular project. That is calling about scope definition. Resource definition. What is meaning by resource definition? Whatever source availability in that field, that is calling about a resource definition. Next, time management. See, particular time you have in a 6 months, 8 months, and 10 months. That is calling about the time management. That particular time management, till March you complete this much work, till uh, April May complete this work, and May June you complete this work. This like you want to make time management. Next, risk management. Risk management means risk management means see, stakeholder engagement. What is calling about stakeholder engagement? Next, budgeting and cost control, communication and coordination. You have a good communication in between two members, in between employees. That is communication and coordination. Decision making. You have a take the good decision. That is calling about decision making. Monitoring and control. You want to maintain good monitoring and control. This is calling about. See, next I am talking about functions of project planning. What is calling about functions of project planning? Defining the project objectives. See, function. What is the main functions of project planning? Defining the project objectives, scope management, task sequencing and scheduling, resource allocation, risk identification and mitigation, cost estimation and budgeting, stakeholder identification and engagement, communication and reporting, monitoring and control, documentation. See, Totally, you having 10 points is there: defining the project objectives, scope management, task sequencing and scheduling, resource allocation, risk identification and mitigation, cost estimation and budgeting, stakeholder identification and engagement, communication and reporting, monitoring and control, documentation and document. This is the 10 points is there in functions of project planning. See, next I'll we go for need for project planning. See, that is very very important. Need for project planning, clarity of objectives, scope definition, resource definition, time management, risk management. See, clarity of objective. You have a good clarity is there in the objectives. That is clarity of objectives. Scope definition. See, you have a good scope is there. That is the scope definition. Resource definition. Next is resource definition. The availability of resource. You have a resource definition. Time management. You have maintained the good time management, past, future, and present. Next, you have a risk management, stakeholder engagement, budgeting and cost control, communication and coordination, decision making, monitoring and control. This is the need for project planning. See, next, functions of project planning: defining the project objectives, scope management, task sequencing and scheduling, resource allocations, risk identification and mitigation, cost estimation and budgeting, stakeholder identification and engagement, communication and reporting, monitoring and control, documentation and documentation. This is the functions of project planning. Steps in project planning: define the project objectives, identify the stakeholders, conduct the project scope definition, create the work breakdown structures, sequence activities, estimate the activity duration, allocate the resource, develop a project schedule, identify and access the risk, develop a communication plan. These are the steps of project planning. And estimate the project cost, establish the project governance, develop a quality management plan, document project plan, review, gain approval. Next, project planning structure. See, that is very very important in the project planning structure. Project initiation, project scope definition, resource planning, schedule development, risk management, cost estimation and budgeting, communication and stakeholder engagement, quality management, procurement and contract management, change the management. Project planning structure: project initiation, project scope definition, resource planning, schedule development, risk management, cost estimation and budgeting, communication stakeholder engagement, quality management, procurement and contract management, change the management. This is the project planning structure. Documentation and reporting, review and approval. See, project policies: change the management policy, risk management policy, communication policy, quality assurance policy, procurement policy. These are all five project policies. Tools of project planning: Gantt charts, work breakdown structure, network diagrammed, project management software, risk assessment tools, resource management software, cost estimation tools, communication and collaboration tools, documentation tools, quality management tools. Next, project scheduling. What is calling about project scheduling? Define activities, sequence activities, estimate the activity duration, develop a project schedule, identify the critical path, allocate the resources, allocate the resources, consider the constraints, update and monitor the schedule contingencies, communicate the schedule, time monitoring effort. Time monitoring efforts, estimate the baselines, regular progress tracking, project status meetings, performance metrics and key performance indicators, earned value management, schedule variance and schedule performance index, issue and risk tracking, change the control, regular communication, schedule adjustment. This is the time monitoring effort. Budgeting schedules, activity level budgeting schedule, project level budgeting schedule, buffer size, buffer management, communication and transparency. This is the budgeting schedule. Scheduling to match availability of manpower, identify the resource availability of manpower, MAP resource availability activities, collaborate with the team members, adjust the activity duration, resource leaving, consider the resource and skill sets, implement the resource management software, regularity monitor and update, adapt to, adapt to changes, communicate the schedule changes. This is the scheduling to match availability of manpower. Scheduling to match release pounds, uh, understand the funding requirement, develop a financial plan, coordinate with finance and accounting, align milestones with the funding triggers, monitor cash flow, collaborate with functional sourcing, pri- prioritize activities, buffer for contingencies, communicate funding requirements, regularly review and adjust. This is the scheduling to match the release points. Problem in scheduling the real-life projects, uncertain and changing requirements, limited resource availability, dependency and interdependencies, critical path variation, external factor dependencies, resource allocation conflicts, estimation and accuracy, communication and collaboration issues, risk events and contingencies, stakeholder expectations. Situation analysis, internal analysis, external analysis, SWOT analysis, stakeholder analysis, risk analysis, performance analysis, and financial analysis. Problem definition. Identify the problem, gather the information, define the problem statement. You want to defining the problem statement. What is calling about define the problem? First, whatever problem is there, you want to identify. How to identify the problem? See, have first find out the gap. For example, you have take the gearbox. That gearbox, the two chances to break down, the two chances to break down, then the tooth you want to maintain either in oddness, either in increase the size. That is the one gap. This gap, that is the identify define the problem statement. Analyze the impact. Whatever problem is there, that will be analyzed. Identify the root cause. Set clear objectives. You have five objectives you want to set clear. Scope the problems and engage the stakeholders. Engage the stakeholder. Validate and refine. Documentation the problem definitions. These are all totally 10 points is there in the problem definition. See, all of you look at here. This is very easy a way to explanation for in your unit 4.